covered the core themes of the issue, and I think it would be good to have you just interacting with each other a little bit on them. And I think something that I'm sure we all got from that world tour that Graham just gave us was this sense of how much of the world is actually being built on informal settlements, and architects have very little impact, whether it's in China or it's in Latin America. And I thought it'd be interesting to ask Chris and Sam, perhaps, how they felt that what architects could bring from a sort of, with typology, perhaps to the informal as well as the formal.
Okay, maybe I'll start. I think to begin with, I think the issue is set up not so much as an issue that brings a finished solution or a fully imagined solution to the problems of, or rather the functional or the physical problems of the city, or in the context of urbanism. But more in a sense that I think Marina mentioned it and also PV mentioned it. What are the tools and how do we begin to use architecture to begin to engage the multiple stakeholders or the different disciplines that are inherently involved in the process of urbanization and in the envisioning and the building of cities. So therefore, let's say, in that sense, I do not see a distinction, therefore, between formal or informal settlements. And this is where we feel that, for instance, the proposition of actually thinking about the city through its dominant types becomes something fundamentally useful. We could understand, let's say, this square from its dominant type, that is the Georgian terrace, as an elemental part that builds up the urban fabric. Similarly, we could also understand, let's say, the urban villages in Shenzhen that seems to be informal, but in the fact that they have become a dominant type, having in itself a meaning in which why it comes into being, but also an inherent deep structure that has a logic, that has a syntax in the way it's built, it's used, and it's understood within the city. So therefore, by understanding type, or rather the dominant type, becomes a very powerful way in which the architect could use his disciplinary knowledge. That is, the object of architectural knowledge is architecture itself. And to use that actually to understand the city.
I think this notion of a discipline, which you've brought up, and also I think Marina touched on, is very interesting in terms of how fast the city is changing. As you say, in Shenzhen there is a very clear type which is probably based on sort of older vernaculars. So even though the city is taking new forms, Marina, do you think there's also a very clear lineage with much older forms?
Of course, there is a continuity. No one claims that there is a radical break between new forms and old forms. And actually, when we talk about urban villages or informal settlements, these are parts actually of the city which emerge from within the city itself, the urban system itself. When I talked about new forms, I didn't only have in mind the informal or the vernacular or the traditional settlements, but especially the cities which are now being designed and proposed in different parts of the world. And these cities or this kind of designs or proposals, they are not always in continuity or in dialogue. Not necessarily with the existing forms or formal patterns, but with the existing either structures or mechanisms which actually generate certain forms.
I mean, are you thinking of, for instance, things which are internationally designed and have no dialogue with the local setting, really? Is that what you're particularly thinking of things in the Middle East? Or
Yes, partly, yes, yes. But I would not put the informal or the kind of environments which develop, as I said, from within existing systems together with the new proposals. And I would not try to talk about these different settlements in the same way. That's why also I said that perhaps
Can I ask something, Marina? How can they be part of our disciplinary knowledge? Because the AA did have a tradition with this small scale, bottom up, build it yourself. It was in some ways it was a disaster, but in other ways it influenced the World Bank. They built all these projects all over the world, blah blah blah. And so it's kind of interesting that the discipline already has inside it
a kind of
a dialogue
with these forms. Yes, yes.
Yeah.
It does, but I don't know to what extent actually the discipline can determine or affect, and to what extent the form of these environments they become part. They become internalized into the discipline, and they become part of our knowledge. There have been many attempts, as you said, in the past to intervene and use that, not only to intervene, but also use this as a way to organize a certain strategies or methods even of design.
Well, what I was excited about was that Chris and Sam seem to have they've sort of come out of a really well-calibrated electronic matrix, we'll put it that way. So that, and it's like, what was really exciting to me about the issue was that, wow, if this could be sort of stood on its head and plowed into what's happening out there, what would happen? It's like, I don't know what it means even, it's a question. It was raised by your issue, and so it sort of triggered this as a question, was like, well, what happens if you turn it upside down, and it somehow people, but with their iPhones and whatever, are somehow empowered. Well, they are already to shape the city with flash mobs and so on and so forth. But what would happen if building I don't know, it's impossible to imagine. But what would happen? I mean, people do it every day. They add to their house in all over the world, and that's actually how a lot of the housing is going to be built in cities. And how do we become, what happens normally is you go in with the UN or someone and you try and monitor it afterwards and clean up or demolish or whatever. That's what they're going to do in Shenzhen. But what would happen if there was a way to bring all this beautiful firepower into the question earlier on, so that people, it's kind of I'm really showing my age here, but it's a kind of archigram thing where, build a wall. Do you remember that thing where you could order a wall from your television set and it would come equipped with such and such? I'm sorry to go off on such a monumental historic question.
I think this plugs in very well with what you were talking about in terms of your kind of reflection on the post-Fordist city and this sense of kind of work having driven forms of the city, and then when work is out there and we're all immersed in work, then it's almost like those types become redundant, or everything.
Absolutely. I think that one of the framework of the Fordist city was that it was made by very much by identifiable typologies. We have the housing, we have the factory, we have the office space, we have the bank, we have the institution. In a way, at that time, there was still a kind of, the state was still able to maintain and to regulate labor and its social consequence within a very rather rigid framework, which was all interconnected, but still retaining its own, let's say, if you want, typological identity. I think that today, the very pervasive way in which we work where in fact all kind of interstitial spaces of the city becomes a possibility of encounter, communication, exchange. And we know that in post-Fordism, these are precisely the attributes of contemporary production. In a way, the whole city as such becomes the factory. It becomes a communication system, and communication today is the way we produce. I mean, communication is production itself. We don't need to apply this. It's already in its own process productive. And in fact, this is actually what many political thinkers call immaterial production. A production that is not supposed to anymore to deliver goods, but is supposed to deliver services. So in that sense, I think that the issue of typology as it was theorized in the past, in a way, completely collapsed, because in a way this condition has survived through a paradox, which is on the one hand to make everything more and more generic, and at the same time it's multiplying identities and idiosyncrasies. And in fact, this is for me where the, let's say, idea of typology, as is actually reintroduced by Christian Sand, could become critical, because the way they have introduced this discussion is precisely to overcome this dichotomy. On one hand, we have the, let's say, the past being represented by very rigid and stable typological framework, actually what Grahame was putting into question. But at the same time, they also try to overcome this sort of celebration of differences that today, for me, has become one of the main fundamental ideology of neoliberal economy, in order to really cover up the fact that the entire city, even in its most remote places, has become a place of production and therefore of economic exploitation.
Well, let's take some questions from the floor, because I think we've had some. Would you like to stand up? Would you like to give your question?
So I've got a question for Marina, if I could, and then perhaps if anyone else has something to add, they could throw their appropriate currency in. So Marina, you opened with a definition of type where you suggested that it sits between method, production and knowledge, that it doesn't reside in the object, right? I think, and I want to sort of just flag the issue of knowledge and epistemologically specific knowledge, because there's a to me a sort of contradiction going on here that I can't quite work out myself. So then if we go into Moneo, and then you raise Moneo's definition of where he opens in his essay on the definition of type to do with being specific to the work of architecture itself. You know, and that sort of Vidler then backs that up with the third typology and the idea of there being three types. But there's a contradiction there between the idea of disciplinary specific knowledge as an epistemological category that type sits within as a reasoning almost, and then this idea that type is specific to the work of architecture. So I'm just wondering, is there something that you could clarify that for me?
I think actually I tried to say that that actually type cannot only be reduced to the signification of the architectural work. Actually, I tried to expand and to open that. That it doesn't have to do only with the work of architecture. It's not only a way, it doesn't give us only the tools or a manner to describe the architectural work as such, at least in the terms that Moneo was thinking of the architectural work. But I try to say that actually type, through its different uses and through actually its extensive use within architectural discourse and practice over the last 150 years or 200 years, in one way it has contributed to the production of organization of a certain knowledge about architecture, not about the work only itself, but the work only as related or as located within a broader context. So it's not about so much the work itself, but how the work is being produced and how it relates to other entities, to either these entities are other architectural works or the city or the historical condition or actually the urban condition. So in one way what I tried to put forward as an argument is that actually the type provides that link between, or establishes that link between the work itself as the artifact, as the singular product, and all the forces which actually contribute to the production of the work, determine the work, and also all the implications of the work upon that context. So that's why I said that type is more, for me, a part of a field of knowledge, rather as something which is to signify and describe the work, refers to the singularity. I don't know if that clarifies the issue.
Instrumentality to it that sits
Yes.
beyond the object.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Because I think it's sort of a recurrent question that's being asked, right? Also, I think the very first question about are we looking at something that's formal or informal, right? And I think that's sort of the same difficulty that ultimately when we talk about type, we talk about something that, well, I try to describe it by saying it is it's sort of the possibility of form, right? But at the same time, it's really also as much a cultural thinking, or it's a cultural influence. And I think this is where PV comes in when he talks about the politics of it. Well, and I think probably there is no such thing than an ultimate answer to it. And I think we've kind of tried to avoid it as well in the work we've done for our students and our research. And rather to think about it that if we have the opportunity through type to think at simultaneously both levels, it gives us different ways to, in a way, strategize of how we define a discipline. And I think you can already tell there are quite different approaches, and historically there are very extreme approaches, where I think Grahame came and said, you're quite happy we are flexible typologists, right? And I think that's the whole sort of part of it. Of course, we know that historically it's the whole sort of Durand ethics that has dominated, I think, the entire discussion of it for a very, very long time. And I think only now, since it's been forgotten, that we can kind of sort of reinvest it with, I think, a different kind of meaning. And I think that's where, you know, I think there is no answer to where exactly it is, right? And I think that's part of the slipperiness of type. But at the same time, we know, and we are guilty of that, we kind of abuse it in both ways, right? I mean, we of course also use it to produce something very, very formal. But at the same time, I think we are also kind of at pains to also to recontextualize it in something that is what I would say is cultural, right? And I think maybe just one thing regarding the urban village. I mean, we had actually quite a number of projects also with our students that looked at one specifically looked actually at urban villages in Shenzhen. So I think there was, and I think I wouldn't say it was the same approach in Urbanos, but I think there was this kind of attempt to look at what can be get of something that's really informal, where architects are, of course, not involved, right? But how can we kind of learn from that and we strategize that and make that part of our disciplinary knowledge?
Yeah, that's actually, I went through it very quick, but I redrew Chandigarh with the 7 villages in that Korb never drew. And when you redraw Brasilia with the surrounding villages that were built by the building workers, it's a whole nother city. And now the subway connects to the villages. So there is this kind of, I don't want to call it formal, informal either. There's different ways of generating a city that actually have to come into relationship. And I agree with you that type is a useful way to make that interface. Yeah.
Well, I have to say, for the sake of discussion, and I think maybe in the framework of the discussion on type, might make a lot of sense to open this question. I have to say I'm increasingly at odds with this distinction that we often made between such a thing that is formal and informal, because perhaps it's a wrong definition of what we intend, something that might be classified as something that this is designed by architects and something that is not designed by architects, no? Because I think that also something that has not been explicitly designed through architectural knowledge has a form, and sometimes even a better form than what has been designed by architects. and much more intelligent form. And in fact, it's interesting that the discipline of architecture is in fact very recent. There's been a lot of architecture without architects before architecture as a discipline have been invented. In fact, the way this knowledge of architecture without architects was managed for a very long time was through a sort of diffuse typological knowledge. I mean, think, for example, of why you travel across Europe and you find the incredible similarities among cathedrals. Well, it's simple because there was a kind of diffuse specific knowledge about building techniques and also their symbolic embodiment, which actually was highly formal, but it was not designed. It was actually literally built through the actual engagement with the real actually raw materials of the city. So in that sense, I think that typology might be an interesting framework in which today one can again challenge this, for me, rather limiting distinction between what we call the formal and what we call the informal.
Actually, you've just reminded me of something, which was that in the subtitle of your text, you talk about the projective cities, and that triggered off a whole thing in my mind. This happens to you when you get old. And I thought of the projective cast from Robin Evans, who taught here and was a student here with me as a student years and years ago. And the whole idea of architectural projection and the discipline and the different types of knowledge you need to do different tasks within the production of the knowledge and the production of the building and the production of the city. It was just sort of very humbling to see that coming back, and made me think fondly. But it also raised the whole thing of projection, and I really worry about myself, if I can just throw this in, like, are we projecting our thoughts and doubts out onto the global crisis, ... Can we, what is our role in this sort of global situation? And how can we work with that? It's a whole challenge, a new kind of challenge for the profession and for professional knowledge, which, as we've said, I love that with the architects without architecture, or whatever, architecture without architects and all that stuff. Rudolfsky and all that, he was from Brazil. It was an amazing chapter, and then what comes after it? Peter Eisenman.
I'm going to let
Sorry.
Colin is trying to put up his hand.
I'm trying to formulate what I would like to say. I'd like to be quite critical in the sense, not so much about some of the debate, but actually I don't know what we're talking about. I really don't know what is the material we're talking about. And it's partly my fault for coming here without seeing the publication. Maybe everybody in this room has seen the publication and therefore knows what the subject matter is that we are talking about. If this was a convention, neither do I know what is the theory being proposed. So I don't know the material, and I don't know what the theory is that's being proposed or in fact criticized in any way. So it's just a procedural point I'm really making. If this was a convention of ornithologists talking about typology of birds in the rainforest, there would be some kind of introduction. This is the universe we're talking about. We're talking about the rainforest in the Amazon. And there might be somebody coming up and saying, my typological analysis of this rainforest is that there's only two kinds of birds, the ones with yellow feathers and the ones with red feathers. And then there would be some kind of debate, well, actually, no, your typology is so narrow, it's so diminishing, it's so incomplete, that I don't know what we disagree, but I don't know what to agree with or disagree with. Let me just finish, Helen. It is a question here. We're talking, I presume, about the city. We're talking, I presume, about architecture. There's some kind of assumption that there's something about how architects behave when they intervene within the city and actually think of a city in terms of a collection of buildings. There's some kind of theme along that, but I'm not quite sure where it's leading. The underlying discourse here is that what is true of any typology, and typology doesn't have any loaded ideology, is an attempt to understand the complexity of the world around you. And what makes a good typological analysis, and a bad one, is whether or not the analysis, the attempt to reduce the complexity of the world around us to a number of relatively clearly identifiable types, is actually working as a reasonable representation of that complexity. And that's really what the issue of typology is. So I could say something, if somebody had come up and said, you know, this is my understanding of typology, I don't really know. All I do know, and I think this is underlying how we all feel about architecture, is that it is true that at the period of modernism, the complexity of the world around us, the complexity of the city, the complexity of architecture too, was simplified to a very, very simple and limited set of rules which we try to sort of roll over the world as we know it. And postmodernists started questioning that and discussing it. People like Colin Rowe in Collage City said, you know, be careful, we can't go on applying one type or a very limited number of types. So there is a discussion here, but I don't know yet if the people around this table, except for Grahame, because he has analyzed the city in terms of a certain number of types, and one could agree or not agree that it is sufficient. But I don't understand what is the material that we could react to, and that's I'm afraid rather a fundamental question. I do not know whether your book, and maybe I should know, but you didn't present it, you see, you didn't actually show what is in the book. Is actually analyzing a new typology of a city, a new articulation of the components that could be that could help us understand the city and intervene the city or not. The discussion about self-help housing came up, and that's a very interesting topic in itself. But again, what's interesting there is the typology. There are some self-help housing which were just site and services. There are others which were providing materials. There's an interesting analysis that we made between different typologies of self-help housing. But I can't, I mean, I'm talking rather too long, but I can't really engage because I don't know what is the corpse that is being dissected.
Let's come back, and I'm afraid I'll put you in the hot seat here, Chris. Can you give us the content and the universe for Colin here?
Yeah, of course, the trouble with sometimes working with a particular topic for so long is that, you know, you are so focused and you perhaps forget, you know, to even contextualize for everyone. But I think Sam and I briefly did in the 10 minutes. I think the main confusion perhaps in what you're saying is that I think you're identifying the issue of type and typology to a fixed object. You want to see what are we looking at in terms of this fixed object, what we learn from this fixed object. Do we replace it? Is it fixed, or do we move on from it? I think we do not see it that way. I think maybe to contextualize in the larger discussion is that when we first started re-looking at the notion of type and typology, we thought that people who were looking at the cities were looking at, let's say, the cities from the point of view of sociology, from the point of view of mapping, datascaping, and so on and so forth, and actually has forgotten that the very basic fact that the city is actually made up of elemental parts, and that elemental part is type in itself. Now, having said that, I think type should not be understood as a fixed object. And this is where we come, I think, with Marina and so on and so forth, to say that, look, at the end of the day, we could understand first and foremost type as an abstract principle that rules over an object, that rules over a archetype, for instance. And I think it is that abstractness of type that is embodied in the elemental part of the city that we want to recuperate. So that's one. The other one is that also we want to say is that type in itself, or typology, which is the logic of type, is something that begins to acknowledge that an elemental part has a logic of its own, that the logic of the elemental part not only resides in its physical structure, but also in its meaning. So therefore, I think, in a sense, it also therefore forms a critical as well as an experimental method in which to understand the city and to also act within the city. And also because you understand the city before you act within the city, it also lends a certain relevance in which architecture could regain in the context of the city. So from our research and the work we've done so far, we have understood, if I have to go into the very specific, is that I brought up the notion of the dominant type. We can understand the city through its dominant type. And we understand the dominant type as being understood in two ways. One is that it is elemental parts made up of small little parts in which it agglomerates into a district, into a neighborhood, and so on and so forth. Or the city could be understood as a dominant type that is a large piece of urban artifact in which it has, because of its size, because of its ability to draw a critical mass, becomes an idea of the city in itself. So therefore, I think, if anything, I think the way we want to talk about type and typology is to recuperate this notion as both as a method which is critical as well as generative, in which we understand the city as well as act within the city. Does that make it any clearer?
It still doesn't tell me the material, but I understand what you wanted to do. It's really just the format of this. It's not really a criticism of your work, because I don't know the work, and so I'm only reacting to the words. And I think the underlying theme, which I think is of interest to all of us, is that most ways in which people have tried to understand cities and indeed intervene within cities have tended, at one point or the other, to be an oversimplification of the phenomena being observed. And there's been a tendency for architects, for historians, also for urbanists, to actually simplify that complex universe. And I certainly didn't talk about fixed types. I mean, I understand this is a constantly evolving and changing environment, universe. But most of the ways of analyzing and intervening have been an impoverishment on the system that we are talking about. What is around us now, the city that's surrounding us now. Most interventions by designers, as well as most analysis by historians, have tended to impoverish the system being observed. That's inevitable in any kind of observation. So my question, which is really a rhetorical question at this point, is I would be interested in your publication to see to what extent the methods that you've used have in fact been successful in accounting for the diversity and complexity of the world around us. And again, I can't comment because I haven't seen the substance. It is I think what we should all be looking for, whether type actually helps us to actually enrich and complexify our responses and make them more sensitive to the environment around us or not.
So I think in that sense you need to get the book.
Definitely. We'll send you a copy.
I think because
I was about to get it when I came in.
Actually, I think it requires that you also get the book before, which is typological formations, because I think this is where that was actually about the sort of work we've done, right? And I think that's why I said sort of in the beginning, we thought of it as sort of complementing that bit, which was that I think in a way in that book we've done what you're asking is what are you actually looking at, right? And how do you look at it, right? That's what you're asking.
But I would really challenge, actually, or counter-challenge this claim you just made about historians and architects, oversimplifying the complexity around us. First, because we should question whether complexity is good. And I have to say that it might be good, but perhaps we should also be aware that in terms of architectural pedagogy, for example, today we are drawing into complexity, where complexity has become a new normative system to basically produce architectural knowledge. So I'm not sure that complexity is good, full stop. I would rather question your plea for, to not impoverish complexity. Second, I think that architecture, by definition, has been always an attempt to make sense and to basically simplify things, whether we like it or not. I'm not saying that to simplify is good or ethically good. It could be ethically bad, but that has been always a fundamental bottom line of the way architects have been instrumentalized, or architectural knowledge have been instrumentalized to govern the city. So either we become more precise. I mean, I agree with your point that a fundamental definition of typology has to be put forward in order to have the discussion. Though I have to say that, ironically, this has been always the fate of any discussion on typology. There's always results in a rather vague, let's say, framework. And I think the effort here of Chris and Sam is to again give a next chance to this discussion if it can produce sense. But at the same time, I would also challenge this cliche that anything that is different, flexible, complex is good. I think that it might be good, but the way this common sense is universally accepted in schools and by architects, and at the end by society at large, for me is highly questionable. So I would really challenge your, let's say, challenge to the whole idea of simplification.
Well, thank you very much for all engaging. One here.
Sorry. I appreciate that you're challenging, like by saying complicity, it is not good, simplifying is good, but could you also collaborate on that? Because it's not enough to say it is not good, why it is not good.
Well, actually that's precisely the point. I'm not saying is good or bad. What I'm challenging is a sort of, I mean, we have go through a period in architectural history where complexity has become a value. No? I mean, universally accepted. It's the way we can overcome the fact that many things are out of control. And we celebrate that sort of out of controlness of the city as the possibility for subjects to express themselves. But we know that at the same time, neoliberal economy very much profit from that kind of blur condition to basically exploit the city. So complexity, I'm not saying that complexity per se is good or bad, but we have to actually historically situate this paradigm, which has been popular in architectural culture for the last 40 years, since Venturi's Complexity and Contradiction, and try to go beyond this sort of a passive acceptance of complexity and the reducibility of the city to intelligible forms as a good thing, as a value. So I'm not saying that it's good or bad. It's simply that I have problems with this sort of celebration of complexity. And I think that many of the things I see here at the AA, and this is actually maybe for the sake of discussion, are just performing that value. Everything that is complex is good.
I'm sorry, but in my opinion, and I think many other people would say that exactly the last 40 or 50 years of history of our domain, it was about simplifying and saying complexity is not good. So, well, I feel it's a questioning the whole field right now. And you are, in my opinion, what you're saying is to say that we're going to change the rules, but in the same time we are not changing the rules because you're proposing exactly the same things which is going on since 50 years.
No, I mean, I'm sorry.
I don't think that Pierre says that it's not about being critical of complexity or arguing for complexity. I think that's not the point, really. I mean, in any case, if we have to operate or intervene somehow in that complex reality, so we need to, first of all, to turn that reality into a legible entity where we can understand, we can analyze, and then we can operate them. Otherwise, we should not be here and talk.
I'm going to have one last final question.
Somehow, in order to act upon something, you need to
Yes,
understand, to comprehend that something. So by doing that, already it's not that you simplify, but you try to...
It's also that there are patterns in complexity and in chaos.
Exactly. You turn it into something which is legible.
Sort of it's like a non-discussion in a way, because you're talking about emergent patterns and being sensitive and being able to read emergent patterns, right?
Yes, but
But
I mean,
exactly. But that's the point, to be able to read.
Yeah.
So
yes.
that's
I
not
mean,
simply
reading
creating.
inevitably means to put things within a framework that inevitably has always some bias or some kind of, let's say, precondition for reading. That's inevitable. I mean, in architectural culture, it's inevitable. So any illusion that we might, with our cognitive process, we might embrace the entirety of complexity as such of the urban world is simply impossible. I mean, it's like to make sense of something that cannot be grasped within our action. So our action need that kind of precondition, knowing that, of course, that precondition is not, as complexity also, that precondition is not good in itself. What I'm questioning is more the way we accept these paradigms. You know, modernists accept the paradigm of simplicity, and in the same way, with the same kind of you know, passivity they accepted that paradigm, we accept the paradigm of complexity.
But
and that's actually what I'm questioning.
Yeah, no, I understand. And I had to struggle with the same thing in terms of the transition out of, say, the modernist, sort of Stalinist setup, and then the breakout with the new voices, feminist, ex-colonial voices, and all of this. But then, of course, the emergence of global corporations. And I think you have to, for me, it's not so simple to say that neoliberalism, of course neoliberalism is a huge problem, and I'm not arguing against that, but I'm saying that you can't just say complexity is neoliberalism equals.
No.
Because it's more complicated.
No, but neoliberalism has embraced the paradigm of complexity.
I'm going to move us on now, because one person who's just desperate for a last question.
Yeah, I'd really like to counterpoint on one of the arguments that the table put forward today, which is, and that deeply worries me, which is blurring the distinction between the informal and the informal city to the point that there is no difference, because for me there is a very strong and very clear difference between what is the formal and the informal city, and it goes far beyond the spatial, formal aspect of the city, which is much more of a social. And this difference is basically the difference between the people that can afford to rent or to buy their dwelling, and the people who cannot and have to build it themselves. And I think this problem goes far beyond the scope of to which the architect can intervene in society.
No,
but I think that to ignore this difference is to legitimize from the point of view of the architects that this is acceptable, which I don't believe it is. And I would also like to say that the idea of the heterotopias that Professor Shane explains in his book, I think we as architects have an opportunity to go into the informal city and start to as architects promote the idea of heterotopias from inside the informal city. And actually, I would like to say I was surprised that you antagonized so strongly with Mike Davis, because I also agree with many of the arguments he says, which criticize the structural complexity, the structural situation of the capitalist system today, which generates this kind of space. And well, I'd like you to comment on this.
Okay, this has got to be quick. I sort of feel it.
Yeah, I'm sorry for bringing this forward so late.
But basically, I don't have any real great argument with Mike Davis. He's brilliant and amazing, but he uses the analysis of a professor at University College, and that professor has written a scathing attack on how he used his figures. And that's why in my book I've got this drawing of the megacities only got 8%. And so 92% of the cities are not these mega slums and all the rest of it, that he thinks there's going to be an urban revolution that comes from there, and that it's going to be driven by this by this misery, and he sort of takes a pleasure almost in the misery of the mass citizens, and that just to me is awful. So I know him, and he's been incredibly important to me over the years, starting from the City of Quartz about LA, and he's one of the great critics of neoliberal city. But at the same time, he's completely mad, and it's like,
Well, let's leave on an optimistic note. Let's not think about misery. Let's just have our hope on those smaller cities. Thank you very much, everyone, this evening. Particularly Chris and Sam, who just delivered a fantastic issue, and all the speakers, Marina, PV, Graham as well, for giving us